Welcome, and thank you everybody for joining us today. This is a webinar conversation about mentoring in the hashtag #MeToo era. Thanks for joining us again. Now, rather than doing a didactic presentation, I've asked my colleague, Dr. Melanie Lorick, to join me in a conversation about mentoring. We're going to look at these relationships first in a broad sense, but also focus on how to think about and navigate mentoring in this time of heightened awareness of the potential for sexual harassment in the workplace that's emerged in the hashtag #MeToo era. So Melanie has recently read my new book called Ambivalence and Mentorship, an exploration of emotional complexities, and is going to be asking me questions today. Indeed, she's going to be interviewing me during this webinar. If you have any comments or questions, we're going to take them at the end of the conversation. Melanie's going to be watching them as they come up. But you can write them down anytime in the chat box as they come to mind. So I guess we can get started.
Yeah, great. Hi, Bonnie. Thanks so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed reading your book. I think it's great, and I think it addresses some of the experiences I have found myself in and being mentoring relationships, even though they may not have been called that. And I think a lot of other people also might be in those relationships or have been in those relationships and have experienced some of the ambivalences you're describing. So my first question is, what is mentorship and what is it not? What does a mentorship relationship look like?
Okay. Well, it's a perfect place to start. I'm defining mentor usually as an older, more experienced person who's teaching a younger person, I call the protege, how to navigate in the adult world and world of work. So that's important as a caveat to say that I don't see these relationships only as workplace related, but rather the development of adult functioning, adulthood in general. I view the alliance as a complicated love relationship because it evokes and satisfies desires for connection through the processes of teaching and learning, while at the same time promoting career goals. Even though many people see mentorship as predominantly instrumental, that means strategic or a rational means to an end, there's growing support for the notion that in order to work well, there has to be a willingness to become emotionally involved. Mentors and proteges often develop affection towards each other through their work together and through involvements with each other's lives outside of work. And I just briefly want to say that there's a difference between formal and informal mentorship. Formal mentorship is the kind that where mentor and protege get together as a result of a workplace program. They're matched. Their relationship is not organic in that sense. And usually these relationships are time limited by the program of the organization. On the other hand, informal relationships, or what I call freestanding relationships, are those that develop on their own. It could be a supervisor-employee relationship, and layered on top of that is an evolution of a mentoring relationship. These are relationships that are not time limited, and they grow usually from some kind of chemistry between the parties.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, you talk about the fact that mentorship is different from mentoring. And can you help me describe or understand the difference?
Sure. We use the word mentoring in the culture very elastically. Mm-hmm. And mentoring is not the same as mentorship. So in brief, while mentoring is an activity, mentorship is a social relation. So let me talk about that a little bit. We will describe anyone who almost loosely fits the concept, including admired teachers and bosses, psychotherapists, sports coaches, our ministers, literary heroes, parents, political figures as mentors. Okay. But this relaxed usage I have found in my research seems to be based in part on what I think of as a grammatical slip. That is, the word mentor, which is a noun, has been converted into a verb. So, like the mistake of saying that anybody who mothers is a mother, or lexicon or our vocabulary permits anybody who mentors or who does the activity of mentoring to be deemed a mentor. Now, the problem with that is that when we lose the idea that mentorship is a social relation that has roles, that has expectations, reciprocal obligations, and mutual gratifications, ideas about what it means to be involved in an authority relationship, we lose the heft, the kind of the essence of the relationship part of things. So calling anybody, just anybody, a mentor or a protege for that matter, because they give advice or offer to sponsor a person, or cover for a subordinate during a difficult work situation, or even serve as role models. In my mind, that's the incorrect usage of the term. It leads us away from understanding the relational essence of mentorship. So I'm just going to give another analogy, which I think perfectly describes what I'm saying. And that is, just because a person could be friendly towards another person does not make that relationship a friendship. Mm-hmm. So think about that. So there's this idea, again, with the social relation that has a lot of expectations and obligations, et cetera, underneath it. And that's different than doing the activity that's involved in mentoring.
Yeah, right. That's a great analogy, and that helps. So how do I know I'm in a mentoring relationship? You've come across a lot of people who were not sure whether they were in such a relationship when you did interviews for your book. Why is it so confusing?
Well, this happens to be one of my favorite topics because it was very unexpected. When I interviewed people for my book, and I interviewed about 100 people and have talked to like dozens of people informally about mentoring. A lot of people say, well, I don't know really what you mean by mentoring. You're asking me about this particular relationship that I have, and what do you mean by mentor? So they ask me to set the parameters of meaning. Okay, so it's the part of the reason why it's confusing is because it's just not well defined in the culture. As a relationship, mentorship lives off the grid. Like I said earlier, it's not like a relationship that you talk about. Like you talk about your wife or your husband or your friendships. It's something that sort of goes underground a little bit. So, and there's only consensus in the idea that people think that there's a common definition of mentorship when there really isn't. And part of this ambiguity, and what I explore in my book, is that there's emotional baggage with the names mentor and protege. People are sometimes afraid to ascribe this title to either the relationship they have with senior colleagues or junior colleagues, or they're afraid about overstating the importance or the specialness of the relationship, assuming a closeness that may not be reciprocated. Like, what if I call you my protege and you don't think of me that way? And that would be something that you would think is reserved for something really special, and you don't think
Right.
that we have that. So the names mentor and protege really call up a lot of consternation and tentativeness in many people about what that means and what that suggests about who we are to each other. So what I did when I did my study to find mentors and proteges essentially was that I asked what kind of mentoring activity. I did a big survey of 1,000 people, and I asked folks to identify what kinds of mentoring activity was going on in their relationships, how frequently those activities were occurring, and how significantly those were impacting the people that were taking the survey. And the people who identified that mentoring activity in the strongest way for the longest period of time. So I only talked to people who were in relationships more than 3 years. Mm-hmm. Those are people that I had first called to do interviews with me for the study. And what I found was that naming the relationship, one banker said the phrase, you mean using the M word? So naming the relationship a mentorship is crucial in this relationship because it demarcates a particular kind of relationship, one that's saddled with expectations and obligations, even if these are not well understood or not defined or not explicitly acknowledged. So coming to recognize the mentorship as a mentorship is a developmental step, and I'll give you an example of that. It coming to call a relationship a mentorship has a significant impact on how parties orient themselves towards each other, and others in their orbit. It's kind of like some people talk about the step that somebody takes when they call their partner's mother mom. Like maybe for a while they might call their partner's mother by their first name, but when they move to calling their partner's mother mom, something different happens in the relationship. It suggests a whole layer of expectations and obligations and feelings about the other person that were not there before. So this is what I mean by calling the relationship, or using the M word, does something to the parties about their understandings of the relationship that wasn't present prior to that naming of the relationship.
All right. So how can students, for instance, find a mentor? Is it a relationship that can be actively pursued?
That's such a good question. And so many of our students want mentors and want to know how they can go about getting mentors. And they certainly can be pursued when you're a student. I would say that the most organic way to connect with a mentor and to find a mentor is to think about all the people that you currently know at work or at school or in the organizations you're a part of outside of work and school, at work and school and outside of your family. People that you think that you can work on a project with or talk with about issues that are important to you. For example, if there's a professor who seems interesting to you and someone who you can explore careers with, or graduate school, or if there's a professor who's launching a new project, let's say a research project in your program, and you feel that you could help the effort, or you could learn about it as you helped. These are sometimes good ways to strike up first connections with someone to eventually evolve into a mentorship. Mentorship isn't something that happens by fiat. In other words, you can't easily will it to happen. It's like any other relationship. It takes time to develop, and doing joint work together and something is a way of bonding. It's and a potential mentor can be found in this way of working together. The same applies to workplace colleagues and managers. You can offer them help on their projects that are of interest to you, and this is going to show you a lot about your motivation to know the other person, but also to learn from them. Finally, in terms of if you're a student and looking for a mentor, or anybody really, there are many wonderful mentoring programs that can match you with mentors, and these can be wonderful. Remember that these are usually time limited, but a relationship can be launched through a mentoring program. It can be the start of something that can grow over time. I think the important thing, and I keep stressing this thing about naming it a mentorship, don't worry about naming this relationship a mentorship right away. Think of it as like I said, as you might think of moving from calling somebody who's a friend to calling somebody who's a best friend. There are these shifts over time. They take time to season. They take time to develop. And they have meaning when you make those changes and those shifts in the naming. So let the relationships season.
So in your book, you talk a lot about the emotional complexities that come with such relationships. And I'm curious about some of the risks that might also be taking place. So I wonder what role emotional intimacy plays in mentoring relationships. Can mentors be friends? Should they be friends?
I'd love to ask that of you, but all right. So I'll go forward with this, and maybe we can save some time later to talk about our own experiences. I think it should be perfectly clear to anybody who's listening that I think that emotional intimacy is core, is absolutely significant in mentoring. Most research suggests that the emotional bond in mentorship is essential. It includes trust and friendship, respect, affection, loyalty, admiration, a desire to influence another person, and on the other side, a desire to learn from another person. These are all part of the mix of attachment between mentors and proteges. And yes, mentors and proteges, I think they can be friends. And I think they should be friends. But we have different kinds of friends, right? So friendships between mentors and proteges have different boundaries than friendships in one's personal life. Some are going to argue, however, that you should keep your personal life and your professional life separate. And take this to mean that there should be no spillover between the two. I don't see the threat of developing a friendship with one's protege or mentor, so long as the concept of the friendship is within bounds and based on shared expectations and obligations. Usually, in fact, mentorships do evolve. Friendships do evolve in mentorships over time. Ones that have lasted a while, meaning some years. And some will think of these and call them professional friendships. This is a way to suggest that they have different qualities than personal friendships, and there are more boundaries in these.
So sort of tied into this topic of emotional intimacy, and also our webinar topic on the kind of Me Too movement. Do you think mentorships are more likely to be affected by harassment or abuse than other work or professional relationships?
Okay, so now we're getting to the meat of this, right, Melanie? So, this is not something that I actually delve into much in my book, but I have, in preparing for this webinar, really looked at a lot of literature, a lot of popular literature, and so I really kind of very excited about talking about this topic because I think it's really important. The short answer to whether the mentorships are more likely to be affected by harassment or abuse than other kinds of work relationships is no. Okay. And part of what we need to do in understanding that answer is to define clearly what sexual harassment is and isn't. So I think very helpfully, and way before the Me Too movement in 1996, two social scientists named Hurley and Fagenson Eland theorized sexuality and intimacy in, we're going to say, cross-gender, meaning male mentor, female protege relationships, as falling along a continuum ranging from non-sexual psychological intimacy in the relationship to the extreme of sexual harassment. And I think that making the distinctions between sex, sexuality, and sexual harassment are really, really key, and psychological intimacy. So most mentorships fall into this category, the first category of non-sexual, meaning platonic, psychologically intimate relationships, characterized, like I've said before, mutual closeness, affection, trust, commitment, self-disclosure, etc. Okay? On the other end of the continuum, sexual harassment. This is a kind of exchange that is not about affection and respect, but about abuse of power and disrespect. And there are two kinds, and I'm going to be legalistic here. Just a lot of people know about these legal terms, but I think it's important to clarify that sexual harassment can either be the kind quid pro quo, which is when an employee is offered something in return for welcoming sexual advances. You get a promotion because you're sleeping with your boss. Okay. The other kind is known as hostile work environment, sexual harassment. Okay, that's when the environment that is created at work is hostile or offensive, and this is created by a supervisor or other people in higher levels within an organization. So what I want to say, this is a really complex question, but what I want to say is that, of course, there are abusive mentoring relationships. There are exploitive mentors. There are, but this seems to come up more in what I would call, it's kind of create this image for ourselves in a Svengali or disciple-like mentorship. That is, where proteges are so enthralled by mentors and they're vulnerable to be taken advantage of and subjugated by the latter. But these kinds of mentoring relationships are really not the norm. So in that respect, sexual harassment is not a higher risk in mentoring relationships. I would say, however, that if mentors and proteges meet more frequently and have more contact, there may be more vulnerability to sexual harassment by the mere fact that they have more contact with each other. But there's nothing intrinsic to the my argument would be to the emotional closeness that suggests abuse of power. It doesn't. If we did think that way, it would be like saying that we think that emotional closeness leads people to want to abuse power, and those two things don't necessarily link. Okay, so
Okay.
yeah.
All right, so that helps clarifying this. But I also wonder on the flip side of this, whether the Me Too movement has affected attitudes towards mentoring.
Okay. Yes. Yes, and there are scores of articles that have been written in the past year, and this is what I was referring to when we first started the conversation about the literature that I looked at to prepare for this conversation about men's fears of mentoring in the Me Too era. So let's get a little data on the map here. So a survey that was conducted this year for the women's empowerment group called Lean In. You may have heard of that. Sheryl Sandberg is the leader of that. Found that the number of men who are uncomfortable mentoring women has more than tripled, rising from 5% to 16% since the recent media explosion of coverage on sexual harassment. Senior male managers, meanwhile, said they were 3.5 times more likely to hesitate before having a work dinner with a junior female colleague compared to a male one since the Me Too movement. And they reported feeling 5 times more likely to hesitate about traveling for work with a junior female colleague than with a male colleague. An extreme example of such nervousness, it was the U.S. Was the Vice President Mike Pence, who told a Capitol Hill newspaper called The Hill that he won't dine alone with a woman other than his wife. And critics of the Me Too movement, including conservative bloggers, predicted that this fear of crossing some invisible line would prompt others to follow what became known as the Pence rule. So men have become wary about mentoring women. And their concern is not that they'll get caught doing the wrong thing, but they fear over whether false accusations or misinterpretations are going to occur, leaving them with damaged reputations, even if they were found to be innocent. So this is the core way of describing their fear. Even when men agree to take on female proteges, unintended slights, of course, can occur. So mentors, for example, who are hyper aware of their behavior, sometimes unintentionally treat women with more formality while developing more chummy relationship with the guys, right? So they might take a protege to a baseball game or on a fishing trip. It's no big deal if the protege is a guy, but it could potentially raise eyebrows if she's a woman. That's at least what what the male mentors fear. The same holds true for asking proteges about their personal lives. So something a mentor might not hesitate to do if the male protege was struggling with some personal issue, but might feel more reticent about asking a female protege about some personal issue if it was obvious that she was struggling. So essentially, most of the concerns boil down to the following. Men having their actions be misinterpreted by their proteges or others. And I want to underline here others. It's going to be important in other things that I want to say today. Feeling vulnerable to accusations of sexual harassment, and worries about the possibility of career harm without due process. Okay, so yet, this is a really important yet. None of the stories we learned about in the Me Too movement was a small, one-time accidental incident in which some man says to some woman at work, "I like your dress." These stories are of men who knowingly, willingly abuse power, usually repeatedly, in order to get sexual favors from women.
So following up on this, can you help us understand men's fear of mentorship in the wake of the Me Too movement a little more. What is that fear about?
This is really critical, Melanie. And I'm so glad that you asked me this question because the fear seems to represent something else. Okay, let me start with that. And there are two approaches that I think are valuable to understanding this fear. One is a sociological approach, and the other is psychological or psychoanalytic. Okay, so sociologists see this reaction as reflective of a culture of fear. So, what do sociologists mean by this? They see this fear as socially constructed. That is, it's encouraged and indulged in corporate America, in the media, in social media, etc. And it's used to perpetuate biased or misogynistic views of women and to normalize gender inequality. So I want to unpack this a little bit more. The idea is that the fear is completely out of proportion to the reality. Okay. In other words, the idea that men should be afraid is used to justify scapegoating women's fight back against sexual harassment as the problem, rather than sexual harassment being the problem. Now it's the Me Too movement that's the problem. Okay, so many articles, I'm just going to cite one from the New England Journal of Medicine, report that men in academic medicine are using the Me Too movement to justify avoiding mentorship of women, depriving them of key opportunities to advance their careers. So this kind of using this fear, indulging it, encouraging it, is a way to kind of say, you know what, even if I never wanted to mentor a woman before, now I have a good excuse. Okay, so that's one scenario, that's one view. But if male managers are reluctant to be alone with or off the clock with women juniors, this really calls into question what exactly these men are worried about. The chance of a woman interpreting an encouraging pat on the shoulder as a come on, or their own potentially sexist or intimidating behavior. So which are they afraid of? And many argue that this particular question is for the men, is a question that men at the top level should be asking themselves. What is this fear about? Am I afraid of my own behavior, or am I really afraid that that women can't be trusted to interpret correctly? So this gets at the heart of what psychoanalysts are asking about men's fear. They see it as a symptom of unrealistic fantasies, not rational assessments. So let me unpack that a little bit. Prudy Gorgachun, who is a psychoanalyst, says the implication of the survey data is that men are afraid of being falsely accused, which we've said, but false accusations of sexual impropriety are actually very rare. She says there's a group of unexamined assumptions or myths about women that the fear is based on include the following. Women are dangerous. They'll falsely accuse men of doing bad things, and they'll entice men into doing inappropriate things. Sound a little bit like blame the victim? That women are hypersensitive and unfair. In other words, egged on by the Me Too movement, they're going to misinterpret men's harmless behaviors as harmful, abusive, or inappropriate. Or that that women are hypersensitive and don't have a sense of humor. We've heard that one before, right?
Yeah.
Or that men can't trust themselves to control their sexual fantasies. Or that men can't stop themselves from acting on their impulses, so that they better not be alone with an attractive female coworker on a business trip. And finally, another sort of unexamined assumption is that men don't know the difference between appropriate and inappropriate behavior. So Gorgachun, I think, smartly says that except for that last one, about not knowing the difference between inappropriate and appropriate behavior, that one indicates a need for education, but all the other ones, all the other possible explanations of men's fear are either fantasies of how men and women behave or prejudices. They are not actually rational assessments. So I think that, in the literature and what we're reading about and hearing about, either focus on these kinds of reflections and interpretations of what the fear is about. That is, that the fear is not founded, And most of this comes from really the business magazines and the corporate magazines and the corporations who are most mindful of the legal issues, or they provide ways of protecting men and or women in the workplace. And we'll get to that in a few minutes.
Right. So should this fear be taken seriously then?
Yeah, yes, definitely. And it needs to be taken seriously for because the consequences, as you see on the slide, of not doing so are to allow men off the hook from working towards gender equity in the workplace. We have to pay attention to these fears, whether they're real or founded or not, and the consequences of not paying attention to them also reinforce sexist assumptions and fantasy-based biases about women and men. I mean, that last group of myths about men not being able to control themselves is as pernicious and damaging in terms of biases about men's behavior and men's impulses as any of the ideas about what women's motivations and intentions. So rather than challenging these relationships in mentorship relationships, or challenging these myths, I should say. So mentorship is something that I think can provide a unique opportunity for developing intimacy without exploitation, respect without the fear of harm, and emotional closeness without breaches of boundaries.
Mm-hmm. So, taking all these arguments you just made about fear and sort of underlying explanations of this fear, how can sexuality and intimacy be managed in particularly cross-gender mentoring relationships?
Okay. And I'm gonna just mention as a caveat here, we're saying cross-gender mentoring relationships, and that in this conversation has mainly been male mentors and female proteges. There are different kind of we have female mentors and male proteges. We have male male and we have female female constellations also. And there are some I think misunderstandings about sexuality in relationships in general, but in mentoring relationships, there are sexual components to relationships. I would say with all mentoring relationships, there's an erotic component, there's a love component, but and certainly when you have a gay protege or a gay mentor or protege, these dynamics can play out as well. Mm-hmm. So I hate to say this, but I kind of want to hold my nose while I talk about some of these tips that are given in the popular literature, because they sort of undermine or they sort of accept the fear mm-hmm. as being legitimate. So, and they're very legalistic. They're meant to protect the organization. I'm sorry, they're meant to protect and men may feel protected by them also, but they're based on a premise that men and women need to be protected from each other. And I don't think the evidence is there that follows from the instances of extreme sexual harassment that have been reported over the last year and have been publicized. So the first thing that I want to say is eliminating sexuality and intimacy from cross-gender mentoring relationships is not possible. It will not work. These dynamics are usually present while not directly enacted, and that's the point, in all relationships. Okay? Most of the tips that are given in popular literature are meant to, like I said, protect men and women as mentors and proteges, and these are the ones that are reasonable. There are a few that are reasonable to me, even if they stem, like I said, from the problematic premise that women and men need to be protected from one another. So there are tips for individuals, and there are tips for organizations. Both sets of tips are geared toward minimizing potentially compromising situations. So the ones for individuals, here we go. If you take your protege to a meal, make it lunch rather than dinner. Skip wine and alcohol. Some of these are quite obvious. Don't hold meetings through late in the evening. Meet in public spaces, not closed door meetings. If you do meet in your office, do so with the door open. Invite other people to your meeting. This may be a good opportunity to bring in other people from the organization to give your protege exposure to new people. Mentor in small groups. Don't make it an exclusive one-on-one relationship. Talk about the protege's work and aspirations, not how she looks. Keep the talk professional, but not impersonal. You can mention and ask about family and hobbies or vacations, but these should not be a focus. Don't run from discomfort. Ask about it. So the whole idea of communicating about what it is that you're uncomfortable about or where there's misunderstandings is a key suggestion to men who are concerned about being misinterpreted. Create a network, like I said, not a singular mentor. Um, Keep mentoring journals. This is a way to, document, to keep track of any problems which develop. And just another idea is to to select someone to be your secret keeper. So there's often a lot of confiding that goes on between mentor and protege. This suggestion is about keeping somebody on the outside as somebody who keeps your secrets, not your mentor or your protege. Likewise, for organizations, to minimize potentially compromising situations, this one I think is interesting. Rely on same gender mentoring relationships. Well, while it might provide some good role modeling and can help to avoid the sexual issues in cross gender relationships, it doesn't eliminate sexual issues when mentors and/or proteges are gay, obviously. And it also has distinct disadvantages for the protege. Since the number of women in top management positions is limited, female-female mentor-protege relationships reduces the number of top-level female managers available for mentoring. Female mentors also tend to be less powerful in organizations than male mentors, and they have less access to important information. So this as a solution disadvantages women proteges. Other tips: establishing formal mentoring programs, offer training that distinguishes the difference between sexuality and sexual harassment in workplace relationships in general, but mentoring relationships in particular, to require sexual harassment training. This one was interesting. Allow remote work. So we can kind of figure out what that's about. Like if the one-on-one in-person contact you have with another person, the less likelihood it is that you're going to be at risk of being misinterpreted if we believe that goes on widely at all. But finally, the top management has to show their intolerance of sexual harassment. It's not enough for them to just circulate the policy on paper. They need to articulate loudly that they're not going to put up with it in their organizations.
All right, great. I think before we move into the Q&A part, and we want to leave enough time, anything that I didn't ask that you want to?
Well, I see that only that one person has posted a question. I wonder if anybody else out there has any comments or questions.
We can answer it. We do provide a report.
Yeah.
So. Okay, so the one question was, can we get a recording? And the answer is, where is it going to be available? Do we know?
We send it an email.
It's going to be sent out in an email. And then enough complaining. What's the solution? Solution to what?
Well, I think we need to ask Jack to clarify his question. What did he think I was complaining about, and what kind of solution is being looked for? I'm not sure what the problem is, so I can't even speak to what the solution is.
Jack, maybe you can clarify the problem. Why do you do this? I have, if it's okay, how to mitigate sexual harassment accusations.
Okay, so on the one hand, I think that I've provided a list of what many corporate magazines and popular newspapers have articulated as ways to mitigate the sexual harassment fears. Okay, so if men are afraid, they can examine their fears. That's sort of one whole area that's possible. I think, the idea that they would ask themselves, what am I really afraid of? I think the slide that's up about using common sense and knowing the difference between civility, basic civility, and inappropriate behavior is something that we sort of take. We want to be able to take for granted. But if there are concerns about what's appropriate or inappropriate, and you're working with a protege, I say talk to the protege about your concern, about whether the protege. I mean, for example, the pat on the shoulder. Let's just say some people are more demonstrative and than other people. Some people would hug their protege if they see them, after a vacation or after some long period of time, and that may not be something that the protege is comfortable with. So some of that kind of demonstrative shows of affection may be something that you need to ask about. I would say that other ways of being proactively protective of oneself. I've given a whole list of those, and I think that they could be useful about sort of minimizing the amount of private contact, alone contact, evening contact, etc. one has with one's protege. So those are the kinds of things that I would say.
So we also have a question from John asking, you mentioned a survey by the Women's Empowerment Network, if you could share a link to that and the research on it.
Sure. I will, let's see. This PowerPoint is going to be uploaded to the to YouTube. But what I will ask the folks in our team here, who will send out an email to all the participants to do, is include some of the links to things like that. I will make sure that the link to the survey, the results of the survey, and this organization are in that email.
All right. So Nathan also has a follow-up question on what to do. So he says, I have found that practical advice for faculty is super helpful. Do you recommend things like always keep the door slightly open, keep conversations observable and interruptible, things like that?
If that makes you comfortable, sure. I mean, there's no harm in keeping the door open. I think that what I've been trying to convey here is not a lighthearted treatment of the tips, although maybe I went overboard a little bit in my view that I think that the idea that men and women have to protect themselves from each other is very problematic. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that the evidence of reports of sexual harassment supports the need to do that. But I don't think it can hurt to I mean, there are limitations that you'll be putting on the relationship if you're so concerned about how you're going to be interpreted that, for example, you limit your contacts in ways that you wouldn't do with a male protege, or you are more formal, as I noted earlier, mm-hmm. with your female protege because you're concerned about being misperceived. So I think maybe you could even talk to your protege about that, about leaving the door open or closing the door. So conversation, communication, expectations are really important parts of talk.
Mm-hmm. So Nicole is asking if you could provide advice for crafting department level recommendations or value statements.
Okay. Department level recommendations or value statements. I mean, I think that what's a challenge is this kind of rub between what I've described in this talk, which is taking the fears seriously and at face value versus reading the fears as symptoms or signs of something that is, it's not that it's unserious, but it's about something else. I think that advice about recommendations would be, I mean, if the department wants to be protective of the department, then it needs to address those on two fronts. One would be the front of asking colleagues, asking employees, asking faculty to think about, and students to think about what they're worried about in terms of male-female mentoring relationships, and to really articulate, as Sheryl Sandberg says, lean into those mentorships. Don't pull away from them. Really try to learn and to be open to understanding what boundaries are appropriate in those relationships. And for those who need a more recipe-driven checklist of guidance, there are those kinds of recommendations that I listed off. I can add some of those articles to the links that we send you also in the email that we send.
Jasmine is asking, I want to mentor, but I feel awkward as though the relationship is being forced or manipulated rather than when two people casually meet and form a bond. How do I get past this? Does mentoring have to feel like a personal bond?
Okay, I'm reading over your question. That's from
Jasmine.
Jasmine. Okay. Well, it's interesting. I think what I would suggest that you think about, Jasmine, is like I talked about earlier in this conversation about trying to work with somebody on some common project where you can learn and they can use your help to begin to think about a relationship that would evolve into a mentorship. I agree that the idea, I mean, a lot of us, including me in this institution, we are part of mentoring programs here, and we're set up as a pair with, for example, was a junior faculty member, and I think that can be very rich. But I think that what our relationship is really based on what we do together, what the protege needs, what they're interested in. I mean, you can't force somebody who is named your protege or your mentee to have a relationship with you. And so you have to kind of understand it in the context of general human relationships. But I get what you're saying, Jasmine, about the feeling that, and the concern of having something feel manipulated or engineered.
Sophia's asking, can you speak about your most memorable mentoring experiences?
Okay, so one thing I want to say is that there's a little link to my book on the slide that you're looking at now, and in the preface, I talk and pay homage to 3 of my most important mentors, and I have really rich memories and feelings about those mentors. I also have very complicated feelings about those relationships. Each of them in their own way. I learned way beyond what the surface learning was about. In one relationship, I learned I hate to sound pretentious, but what it meant to be an intellectual, not just a sociology student. I mean, this is a person who really taught me how to think big and how to love thinking. And that was just like not something that you could like teach like by giving somebody a book to read. I watched this person and how they asked questions about all the things that they took for granted, and how they were so interested in the life of the mind. So you could say that I had a love relationship with each of these mentors in their own way, because they were very careful, and I mean that caring, full of care in how they regarded my learning and my development, and gave me things, and you'll read this in the book, but gave me things that were lacking in my own upbringing. So often there is a kind of transference between one's relationships with important mentors and something that either didn't take place or did take place earlier in one's life with one's parents.
Ian is asking, I support my students with leadership development outside the classroom with hikes and backpacking. Young men and women participate. I try to keep the groups between 6 and 20 and involve female trip leaders and male trip leaders. Similar programs are peaks and professors at USC and UCLA. Are there unique tips you can advise that would be outside those tips you provided in the school to, I guess, foster those relationships, is how I understand the question.
Okay. Well, I think that, one thing that I would say is these kinds of group programs are terrific because they give the proteges or the mentees, the students in this case, an opportunity to develop relationships with peers as well as with leaders. And so I think that there's a lot of potential for really important life relationships. And also what I love about this idea is the experience, doing something together. See, there is something about shared history. And when I say shared history, I don't just mean like you spend time together, but you're actually doing something together. You go through something together that bonds people. People often talk about, for example, folks, soldiers in the army, that they have bonds that are, incredibly intense because they go through something, in this case, usually pretty traumatic and terrifying together. But in a kind of backpacking trip, there's lots of challenges. So I think that this is a great way of fostering relationships between the students and between the students and the leaders. But I think that I think that's different than a one-on-one mentoring relationship. And I'd be hard pressed to talk about the differences right here on the spot, but I think that, obviously in a one-on-one mentoring relationship, there's the authority component of that relationship, and there's the, if you will, monogamous part of the relationship. There's something that happens when there's two people together that's very different than happens in a group.
So Nathan is asking, I've presented advice to my faculty in this way. Here are some things we tell our students to be leery about. So if you do some of these things, for instance, meet in private, comment on personal appearance, ask probing personal questions, etc., you may unwittingly be making students uncomfortable. Do you think that is a good way to approach giving advice to faculty? By the way, all this is in gender neutral language. I agree with you that any advice that asks faculty to treat cross-gender relationships differently is very wrong. Since I'm gay, but I'm also a man, I've always approached it that way anyway.
Okay. So, Nathan, thank you for your question. I think that what we want to do is we want to make people comfortable with mentoring so that if faculty take to these tips and these suggestions, and that allows them to feel a comfort level at the beginnings of getting to know their students or potential proteges or mentees, great. All the things that you mentioned, meeting in private, not commenting on personal appearances, asking probing questions, personal questions. I would add, be mindful of physical affection. Again, because these are things not necessarily that they can be misinterpreted, although they could be, but that people vary in terms of their openness to particularly the last thing about physical touch.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question from Sarah, and she says, in your research, you have noticed an increase of terminated mentoring relationships, just considering the difference between creating a new relationship versus those that are currently existing in the Me Too movement. That's just clarification question, yeah.
Yeah, my research, unfortunately, does not cover terminated relationships. That is, my focus was on trying to understand what makes them last, not what breaks them apart. And that's a really, really important question. It is something that I would, that certainly needs to be further researched.
Mm-hmm. And Maria has a follow-up question on Nicole's question, who earlier asked about crafting department-level recommendations. So she asked, as a follow-up to Nicole's question, or department-level protection, how can we change the approach to being more proactive and create a positive culture that doesn't require protection?
Yay! Okay, so I mean, we're Maria. Our minds are in the same place, sort of, because I don't know that the department or organizations really in those contexts that men and women require the protection. We have protection from sexual harassment laws. But apart from the legal issues, I think that what we need to do is really, I think, turn inward and question the assumptions, for example, that Gergachon identified about that are myths about women being dangerous or women being hypersensitive. They're prejudices about how women behave, and they're prejudices about what trigger men and how men control their impulses or can be enticed or seduced to not control their impulses. And I think that this is a broader societal problem. It's certainly not just a workplace problem. So to create a more proactive and positive culture in the department, I think means a lot of talking about these issues and a sense that asking questions and going there with the questions that seem taboo about one's relationships with other people is part of growing.
So I think I have one more. It follows, up on the conversation you just had with webinar participants, and I'm just wondering if there's anything else that hasn't come up that speaks to how institutions or organizations can foster those relationships without necessarily shaping them to the last detail by assigning people to one another and sort of making it very institutionalized.
I have just a short moment. I've been being told that we're going to go off air in a second, but essentially, I think that institutions need to think about creating a culture in which there's a real awareness of the rewards for people in senior positions to connect with junior people in their personal rewards, their professional rewards, their organizational rewards, and those. I'm not sure that mentoring programs. Mentoring programs are good and they can initiate relationships, but maybe there needs to be another step beyond the mentoring program to encourage those relationships to sustain after the program is over. So off the top of my head, that's one of the ways that I would approach this. But I think that the question bespeaks the point, which is that this needs to come from the top. It needs to come from institutions and organizations, that mentoring relationships are things that people ought not be afraid of. They do take time, they take seasoning, but there's fabulous rewards involved.
I think we are running out of time. Thank you, everyone, for listening in and chiming in.
And thank you, Melanie,
Bonnie,
for such great questions.
Thank you for writing such a wonderful book.
Thank you to everybody for your great questions. And you'll be hearing from us by email soon.